Hey everybody, if you haven't seen it already, part one of this little series on harmony is going to be the first link in the description. I highly recommend you go watch that before watching this just so you can understand a little bit more about my perspective on harmony. All right, let's get into it. Harmony is super abstract, and developing composers tend to run into roadblocks when trying to get more creative with their harmonies, or just trying to work with sound worlds that are a little bit less traditional. A lot of these roadblocks stem from our understanding of Western functional harmony, which can kind of be seen as a sort of security blanket. And when we try to venture outside of that, it can seem totally paralyzing because of seemingly infinite possibilities. The goal of this video is to help composers feel more comfortable in venturing into that unknown so that they can write more creative harmonies on their own and then keep moving along the path to developing their own voice. This video will very specifically be about individual chords, not how one chord follows another. That might be a future video I do, but in this one we're really just talking about individual vertical harmonic structures. I also want to say that this video is really going to get into some of the particularities of this topic, and that may seem a bit exhausting. The ultimate goal here is to show you an expanded and elaborate version of a strategy that you can use to work with harmony. Eventually, these processes will become much quicker and can even become automatic. I'm just here to kind of deconstruct that, show every single step, and perhaps offer a different perspective. All right, here are a set of commonly used chords in Western music. Of course, each of these chords has their own functional label that distinguish them from one another, like major and minor. But what actually is it that distinguishes one of these chords from the next? The immediate answer that comes to mind is, well, the notes. And while yes, that is true, we do need to dig a little bit deeper. What is it that actually determines where each of these notes go? It's the relationships or the distances between the chords. The intervals are actually what are important when we're talking about what distinguishes one chord quality from the next. This is why key center has no effect on the quality of a chord, right? So a minor triad is going to be a minor triad so long as it consists of a minor third and then a major third on top of that. I very likely haven't revealed anything new to you. I'm just trying to redirect your way of thinking about what you probably already know. Of course, this system isn't all that useful when dealing with simpler like triads and seventh chords, right? But if we really focus on the intervallic aspect of chord construction rather than what pitches go where for what chord label, we can really free up our way of thinking about harmony. Now, of course, the consequence of this throughout history has been our Western way of labeling chords with Roman numerals and figured bass. And indeed, there are standard ways of identifying more complex harmonic structures. But just for the sake of getting in this headspace of thinking in terms of intervals, we are not going to be worrying about labeling chords right now. So if you watched my previous harmony video, you know that I'm kind of all about self-definition. So a really good first step to take with this is to define how you personally feel about various intervals and how, consonant or dissonant each of them sound, as well as whether or not they portray a particular emotional aesthetic. And a really easy way to do this is to just sit at a keyboard and play every interval in relation to one note. Again, it doesn't really matter which note you're putting all these intervals up against because every interval of one quality is going to remain that quality regardless of tonal center, right? So you could just play a C along with every other note within like 2 octaves. I don't think you need to play every single possible dyad on the piano. You could, but I don't think you need to do that. So just bear with me for a second. I'm going to give a couple of examples of how I feel about certain intervals, and then I'm going to show you exactly how I can use that information to my advantage when creating more complex chords. Okay, I'm going to give 3 examples, and the first one is the perfect fifth. Okay, so to a lot of people, this is one of the most consonant intervals, second only to maybe the octave. It has a very peaceful and open feel to it. It doesn't feel like it needs to move anywhere. The second example is a minor ninth. And this to me is the most dissonant interval, but remember that that doesn't need to be the case for you. This is just something that I use to write some of my more hideous music. The interval clearly wants to contract into an octave, and it makes it very easy to generate tension in a chord. The last example I'll give is the major third, which is much more consonant than the minor ninth, and in my opinion, much brighter and warmer than the perfect fifth, even though it's probably not as consonant and unmoving. It has a sound that people so commonly associate with positivity and happiness, which is why we so commonly hear this vague generalization of major is happy and minor is sad, right? Okay, great, but how does this help us? How does this help us write more thoughtfully? Well, if we think about chords in terms of intervals rather than pitches, it can actually reveal a lot to us about the qualities of those chords, particularly chords with a lot of extensions. Now, all that's really saying is that if you have a chord with a bunch of different notes in it, it can actually be much more revealing to analyze the qualities of the intervals that comprise that chord rather than just figuring out what extensions are on the chord and how that should traditionally be labeled. Now, I just want to say real quick, this is not in any way meant to replace the existing systems we already have. It's just a different way of thinking about the same stuff. And hopefully this can help you if you're finding that you're stuck in a particular place in your music. So let's write a few chords with particular aesthetics in mind, and I will show you how this can help. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to have the roots of all of these chords be C. So let's take each of our previous intervals as examples, the perfect fifth, minor ninth, and major third. Each of these intervals now means something to us on a spectrum of dissonant to consonant and on emotional spectrums as well. And once again, that's going to look different for everybody. Starting with the restfulness and unmoving quality of the perfect fifth, how can we create a chord of this quality, not just a dyad? One approach we could try is to simply stack a bunch of that interval on top of itself. So this chord is obviously comprised of 5 perfect fifths, but it's also comprised of 4 major ninths, which is another open and peaceful interval to me, as well as 3 major 13ths, 2 major 17ths, and 1 enormous major 24th. Now, this kind of identification may sound silly, but it's important to understand every relationship between every single note in a chord if we're to truly understand what makes a chord sound the way it does. Let's hear how it sounds. It's a pretty basic and sparse sound, and part of what makes it seem so sparse are the larger intervals we identified, which is basically another way of saying that the notes are enormously spaced out, and almost all of the intervals are consonant, so all those factors together make the chord seem pretty airy, not very much substance in it. If we wanted something of a similar aesthetic, but maybe a little bit brighter, we can color it and warm it up with some brighter intervals, or even some slightly more dissonant intervals. Now, a benefit of this intervallic thinking in this context is that we don't actually need to change any of the pitches. We can simply change what octave some of the pitches are in, which will create new intervals. Let's take the top 2 notes and move them down an octave. Now we've added some brighter intervals to the chord without changing the pitches, and the intervals that we've added are most noticeably major seconds and perfect fourths, but we've also reduced our largest interval from a 24th down to a 16th, which will make a huge difference in how the chord comes across. So now we have something that's a bit more dense and definitely brighter. And for reference, I'll go ahead and play one after the other. So this is a really excellent showcase of how when you're trying to work with a particular interval or set of intervals, you need to remember all of the subsequent intervals that are generated by consequence of what you've just created, because those are all going to contribute to how the chord sounds. Okay, so for this next one, we're going to take a little bit of a different approach. We're trying to create a chord that has a similar aesthetic to the terribly dissonant minor ninth. Okay, so instead of just stacking a ton of minor ninths on top of each other, let's be cognizant of the other intervals that we can use to help us achieve what we want with this chord. We can start by just having 2 minor ninths on top of each other. Okay, it's kind of empty, so let's add something that can both ground the chord as well as add some more flavor to the dissonance. To thicken the chord in a way that doesn't change the mood too much, we can add a perfect fifth above the bass note, in this case a G. Now, adding this G isn't just creating a perfect fifth with the bass note of the chord, but it's also creating a diminished fifth, or a tritone, between the G and the D flat. We also have another perfect fifth between the G and the D natural, but it's displaced by an octave, so it's really a perfect 12th. So we've both thickened the bottom part of this chord as well as generated a tritone, which helps flavor our dissonance a bit so that it's not just stacked minor ninths. The top half of this chord is still a bit empty, so we can go one step further and add a minor ninth above the G we just added, which is actually creating another tritone, so now we have a very solid and dissonant chord. So now we have some experience using intervals of similar aesthetics to kind of help each other out and create a more unique chord. This seems like a good time to say again that while I'm talking about all these things very much in detail, in practice this stuff is going to look much more rapid fire. So maybe if something isn't sounding quite right to you, then it's worth going through and deconstructing the chord in this way. But more often than not, this is going to be very, very quick. For our third and final chord, which we want to be bright and warm like the major third, we're going to use yet another approach, which is a bit more representative of what this process looks like in action. And that is to take already existing and codified chords and then combine them to create something that's a little bit more unique. To use the traditional terminology, we're going to be creating a polychord. So when thinking of chords that have a very bright and warm sound, the major triad is obviously a pretty strong candidate. So let's build a C major triad, and then a major second away, let's build a D major triad. So an important question here is, why did we choose a major second? Obviously we can try this at varying distances for different results, but I find that if we arrange the notes properly, having two major chords whose roots are a major second apart results in intervals that tend to be very bright and fitting for what we want here. So let's hear how this sounds. Okay, that's a bit much. So let's space it out a little differently and stretch the chord out a bit. So now we have a much less dense sonority, so let's hear how this one sounds. I think that really accomplishes what we're going for, and it demonstrates two main things. The first thing is that this process can clearly be expedited to the point where you don't need to analyze every single interval or think in that much detail. Now the reason for this, as I've just shown, is that we're already internalizing these certain sonorities and certain sounds, and we already know what those things mean to us, so it just helps us work quicker. And obviously if it doesn't sound how you intended or how you thought it would sound, then you can go ahead and analyze it. The second thing that this demonstrates is how drastically the voicing of a chord can affect its quality. And we saw this with the first chord as well. So even though all the pitch classes are the same, arranging what octaves they're in with a bit more care can really affect the quality of the chord. So these are three pretty tame examples of a realm that has pretty much infinite possibilities, and I would really invite you to explore that. One word of caution is that while it's an amazing thing to explore this stuff endlessly, when you're actually writing a piece, you'll almost definitely need to reestablish some kind of self-defined rules just so that your music can have some sort of consistency to it. Obviously, it takes some tweaking to know what the best rules for any given piece is, but that's just part of the composition process. I really hope that this video has helped you, or at least offered a different perspective, and if it has, just know that these videos take a lot of time and effort, and I would really appreciate if you were to hit that like button or subscribe if you want to see more of this stuff. Any of that stuff that helps the video perform well, I would really appreciate that. I may do another one of these videos, and if I do, I think it'll be, like I said at the beginning, more about how harmony can be horizontally explored, so like chord progressions and things like that. If you really want to support my channel as well as my virtual orchestra, my Patreon page will also be linked below, and you can peruse the various benefits that are offered there. Stay happy, stay healthy, and I will see you soon.